Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Last year, St. Louis Alderwoman Alisha Sonnier unveiled legislation known as the Unhoused Bill of Rights. It was a response to increasing concern from city policymakers over how governmental officials and agencies interact with homeless individuals. Ultimately, Sonnier went back to the drawing board after a lot of criticism from the public and her fellow elected officials. And now she's proposed a major change to how shelters can be approved in the city of St. Louis. Joining us to talk about her bill and whether it can make it through a difficult legislative gauntlet is Alisha Sonnier, the alderwoman for St. Louis's 7th Ward. Sonnier represents areas of South St. Louis that include Botanical Heights, Tower Grove East, and Benton Park West. Alderwoman, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you so much for having me.
When we last talked with you on St. Louis on the Air, you proposed a lot of different ideas, including the creation of intentional encampments and restrictions on when city officials can break up encampments. Mm-hmm. It also completely did away with what's known as the plat and petition process for shelters, which currently require 51% of signatures of people who live within 500 feet of the proposed site. Why did you end up shelving that legislation?
Well, I think, for me, I understood that this would be one of the first serious conversations that the city had about unhoused in a very long time. And so when we were in the process of forming the first round of bills and filing them, I felt like I really wanted to take time to figure out what are all of the major issues. And they were what you named. They were, people are forming, unhoused people are forming communities. We don't have a process that we have to honor for connecting them to resources and for breaking those communities up. We don't have a place where folks can go if we are going to break those places up. We learned that the plat and petition process hadn't led to a shelter opening in 15 years. And then I also learned that not a single one of our zoning areas allows for shelters. And so I decided, okay, those need to be the three focuses. Let's do it together. I think after that first round and after having that conversation, what happened is we just couldn't build consensus. There wasn't enough of sort of a political will to get all of those things done at once. But it did lead to a lot of conversation. It led to a lot of folks putting their input, giving their thoughts, and it put me in a position to very quickly get hours upon hours upon hours and hundreds of folks' worth of input and thoughts on what's working. And I think where I landed is that one of the things that I heard every person say, even if they were in opposition, is that we do have a shortage of shelters and we do want to help the unhoused community. And so I decided just this second round, let's just focus on one issue at a time, and let's start with the thing that's going to meet the immediate needs that we have.
One of the people who was not a huge fan of your bills was St. Louis Mayor Tashara Jones. She was recently on the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air, and Jones said she would like to provide as much, quote, temporary and transitional housing as possible. She said she wanted to get to the root causes of homelessness and pointed to success stories like Jefferson Spaces, which is a tiny home village in the Carr Square neighborhood. How is what you were doing not getting on the root causes? Because I'm sure that you have a difference of opinion with the mayor on this one.
I think my response to the mayor and anyone on this issue would be that we have to be careful not to force ourselves into binaries, and we have to be careful not to make it seem as if we can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. The moment we start talking about the unhoused issue and we force it into either we do nothing and do a regional call, or either we do nothing and we address, the unhoused issue at its roots, we've just forced ourselves into a binary that doesn't exist, because the reality is there are people in our communities who absolutely need us to get to the root causes of unhoused. But at the same time, we know that there are people who do overheat in the heat, who do freeze in the cold, and who are in dire need of shelter, and that we have an extreme shortage of it. And so we can do both. I think that it's not, I would support any conversation around getting to the roots of unhoused, but I also support meeting the immediate needs of our community.
So enough retrospectiveness. Let's talk about the present day. You introduced a bill at the beginning of the month that would make some major changes to the aforementioned plat and petition process. Tell us about what your bill would alter.
So this bill is essentially a reform plan petition bill. I think one of the first things you would have to see to kind of see where some of the influence of this bill came from is we're actually looking at the plan petition process as it pertains to liquor licenses for restaurants. And that is something that the mayor's office has been a huge role in. That's something that Alderman Ryan has done an excellent job at working on. And so I think you do see at the city leadership level, there are many of us who are acknowledging the barriers and the challenges and the failures of this process, because ultimately, if the goal of this process is to open shelters, but we're not opening any, or to open any of these special residential uses, we're not opening, the process is failing. So this new bill is saying, let's start with this process that it seems like we all have mostly agreed is antiquated and is not working, and let's put some proposals in place and create a process that, not only helps unhoused providers have a process that they can navigate, or any of these facility folks who want to bring these facilities forward. Let's also immerse community into the process, because there was a lot of voice that I think is very valid from community to say, I don't feel very included in your process as it is. And so, of course, I have a lot of hesitations to changing it. And so these changes to the reform plan petition process are all aimed at really expanding democracy, at really putting in public engagement in at several points, and giving us a chance to have these facilities not just in communities, but a part of communities.
So, as I mentioned before, currently you need 51% of, I think, residents within a 500 square radius of a proposed
property
shelter.
owners are registered voters.
Okay. So this would lower it to 25%. Why did you arrive at that number?
So we changed the entire process. So I'll just kind of walk you through what that process is,
Sure.
and then kind of how we changed it. So right now, let's say someone wants to open up a shelter in the Tower Grove East neighborhood. They would have to start by collecting 51% of signatures within a 500-foot radius, and it would have to be yeses. And then if they're able to get those signatures, so that means 51% of folks came to their door, had conversation, and signed, then they would turn those signatures in to the planning department, and they would verify the signatures. The way that the planning department does that currently is they actually are manually calling each person. And that might have a huge reason why so many people have been unsuccessful with this process, is because you're manually calling, and obviously that's also a huge inconvenience to
And
the
especially
staff.
if you're talking about a neighborhood with a lot of people in
Right.
it, that could be a very time-consuming process.
Right. And then let's say you got those signatures before people didn't answer their phone. Well, you've lost your window. You can't open your facility. And again, we should remember that at this point, they're just trying to get a hearing. So this doesn't give them the green light to open their doors, to operate their facility. This is just for them to get a hearing, to get to the point where they're actually engaging in dialogue and conversation. So you would do that. And then after the planning department verifies your signatures, and if you're able to make it through that, then you have a hearing. And that's like as simple as the process is now. My bill adds to that. So we are reforming that. So under this bill, you would go and collect 25%. The simple answer for that is because we want it to be a navigatable process. It's because unhoused provider after unhoused provider has said, hey, I'm not able to get, it's not even necessarily that people are saying no, they're not coming to their doors, or when I'm turning them in, I'm not getting answers. And so this bill changed it to 25%, but also it requires that the unhoused provider notify 100% of people within a radius, because they have to send a postcard. So long as people in that area go and collect their mail, then they would get a postcard that will have the hearing information, which was always meant to be the place for those conversations to happen. So that's a big change. And then once you turn it in now, we're also changing who would do signature verification. Rather than manually calling, let's bring the process into 2024. And so it would be the Board of Election Commissions who does that signature verification.
The Board of Election Commissioners, yes. Yes, continue.
Yes. And Board of Election Commissioners, they do the signature verification for candidates like myself to get on the ballot. And they also work with the Excise Commission to do some liquor license verification, because, again, they have the same process. And so let's have the same department be responsible for it. But the benefit is that they have technology and software and access to databases where they can do it in a way that doesn't require as much manual labor.
And who would make the final call on whether the shelter permanently opens?
So if you get granted your signature, you've got your 25%, you've sent out your postcards, you've got your hearing date. When you have your hearing, when you apply, because not one of our zoning areas in the city of St. Louis allows for shelters, you are instantly denied. And so all of those denied applications, they then go to the Board of Adjustment, and it will be the Board of Adjustment who carries out your hearings, which in regards to hearings, that's the other big change of this bill. We are introducing, in addition to increasing public notification, we are introducing a provisional license for shelters. Because what I would hear community after community say, and even some of my colleagues, is some questions for the city's revocation process, feeling like it takes too long to navigate. I'm concerned if a shelter comes into my community and it's a public health or a public safety hazard, how would I address this? Well, I think that the provisional license there is the answer, because it can allow communities to know, hey, the shelter may get permission to operate, but that will be for 4 months, and then they will have another hearing. I think that's critical, because that's what's going to inspire and motivate the unhoused provider and the community to stay in conversation with each other and do that immersive process, because you know that you've got another hearing in 4 months. And then at the 4-month mark, that hearing goes well, you get granted again, you get to operate for another 4 months. And then at the 8-month mark, you then can be granted a permanent license. And I think that's important, because we should not be having these conversations based off of preconceived notions. This will give communities the opportunity to try a facility out, to track progress and pull data, nuisance reports, police reports, rather than just, concerns of how it can operate. Hopefully now we know that we can kind of have a community check-in period with each other.
We are talking with Alderwoman Alisha Sonnier, the sponsor of Board Bill 227, which makes major changes to how shelters are approved in the city of St. Louis. Before we talk about the reaction to this bill, I want to take this conversation a little bit of a different direction. There are so many issues in St. Louis that you could be introducing bills on, but you are very passionate about helping the homeless. Mm-hmm. And I'd be interested to hear what inspired you to give this another go, even after your first bills got a lot of criticism.
Well, you know what? It's Women's History Month, Jason. For me, I think that the unhoused is an issue that none of us are too far from. And it's an issue that's highly stigmatized. The reality is, a report just came out that said that Missouri and St. Louis has one of the highest rents increasing. The reality is that chicken wings are like $16 a pack, and we have senior citizens in our communities whose Social Security is not increasing with the rest of these wages. Majority of women who are unhoused are actually fleeing relationships from domestic violence. And so how could I not connect to this issue knowing how close it is? And I've had my own personal experiences with being at risk of being unhoused. And it wasn't because I was an addict of any sort. It was because my family was in a domestic violence situation and we needed to be able to relocate quickly. And I think, of course, I would also lift up that I did serve on the Board of Education, where I saw that 20% of our kids, 1 in 5 of our families in public schools, are unhoused. And so it is an issue that is prevalent in our city and that is challenging most of us. And I think that the least that we could do is to provide a pathway that is navigatable and that people can succeed in.
So I was watching a hearing about your bill from earlier this week, and we heard from a number of representatives of neighborhood associations, including Keith Fairchild of the Boulevard Heights Neighborhood Association. And needless to say, he was not a fan of your legislation.
No one wants flat petition modified. No association, no planning group, no planning committee, whether it be up on St. Louis Avenue or down on Sublet. Everybody wants involvement in what happens in their neighborhood. I take great pride in meeting with a lot of different people, and the stories are all the same. We want to say what we want to say, so what happens in our neighborhoods. That's very important to us.
That is Keith Fairchild of the Boulevard Heights Neighborhood Association speaking at a recent committee hearing of the Board of Aldermen. You have heard probably a lot of comments similar to Mr. Fairchild's. Mm-hmm. They're going to probably come up again during this process. What would be your response?
First of all, I think it's important to thank Mr. Fairchild just for engaging in the process and for taking the time out of his day to come to the hearing, to, weave together his thoughts and to give his input in the process, because that is what democracy is about. And that is what, us being a community, we're going to get our best communities when we all engage. So first of all, I just want to make sure that I thank him as well as anybody else who has engaged with this process so far. My response to him during the hearing, I smiled at him and made sure that he could see that I was making eye contact impact and was hearing from him. But I would obviously have to respectfully disagree with him. One of the things that I've done this second round is I've actually taken time to go to many of my colleagues' neighborhood meetings and talk to them about this legislation and talk to them about what I was thinking. And in a room, there's not a single room that I would talk about this bill and not leave without the room erupting in a round of applause. There's not a single one of those rooms where I would go to and someone would come up to me and say, hey, I want you to know that I've been in a position where there was someone unhoused and I couldn't find a space for them to go. Or someone who would say, hey, I actually have a family member that's going through this and I'm glad that we have someone who's compassionate and having this conversation. I think in regards to there's not a single community who wants Plaid and petition change, that's not true. All you have to do is go and watch the Board Bill 60 hearings where we saw, I mean, in that case, particularly minority business owner after minority business owner come and say what a barrier and a challenge this process is. The other thing that I would say is that political leaders have very interesting jobs. And so I feel like as Alderwoman, it's my job to let a community know how something is or isn't working for us. And I don't see how you can say, again, if the goal is to ban shelters, then the city's doing a great job and the Plaid and petition process is working fine because that's essentially what's happening. Very few people are able to make it through, and those who do are finding loopholes. However, if the goal of this process is to have a process that immerses community and that vets the shelter so that it operates in the best interest of those receiving the services and in that community, we're failing. And you really can't argue with that because you have to be able to produce results in order to say that what we're doing is working.
Have you heard any concerns from residents who fear that if a shelter is built close to a residential neighborhood, it could have an effect on their property values?
Absolutely. I don't think you're ever going to have this conversation, and you don't hear that dialogue. I think that that's a valid concern. I think for me, there's just the thing with this issue that I think we have to root ourselves in is we have to understand that the unhoused population is here. And so a lot of times we're not talking about whether or not they're present. We're just talking about whether or not they're going to have a place to go and get resources. And the reality is they're going to have a disruptive presence if they don't have places to go and they can't get resources. They're going to go in the vacant home next to you and they're going to set up shop. And that's what our firefighters are going to have to spend time on is putting out fires because that's where unhoused people could go to get resources. They're going to be in your parks. You're just going to encounter them in disruptive ways if they don't have places to go. So while I do think that I'm concerned that it's going to negatively impact my property values, your community is being negatively impacted now by everybody in it not having the resources that they need.
The mayor's office says they're reviewing the legislation. They don't have a hard or fast comment on it right now, but I do want to play you a clip from our conversation with the mayor on the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air, which caught my attention.
I became chair of East West Gateway Council of Governments. For your listeners' edification, that is all of the county executives from O'Fallon, Missouri to O'Fallon, Illinois. And we meet monthly. And last year, I called on them to do a regional crime summit to talk about crime as a regional issue because crime doesn't stop at our borders, especially not St. Louis's borders. And so we're moving forward on a crime strategy there. Next, I'm going to call for a serious conversation about how we can all pull together to help our unhoused because it is a regional issue. What we find when we do our point in time count of where people come from, over 50% or more come from outside of the city. And I'm not saying that we don't want to take care of them, but it's not sustainable for the city to shoulder the burden for the entire region.
That is St. Louis Mayor Tashara Jones on a recent episode of the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Beyond your reaction to the mayor's comments, what do you think of the philosophical idea of maybe a regional approach? And when I say regional, I mean other governments are actually allocating money and doing things to make sure the city is not the only jurisdiction that has to bear the burden, as the mayor said.
I 100% support a regional call to action. I 100% support. I would be the first one at the table, and she and I have had this conversation. When she gets moving on that, I think I will be there with her, supporting however I can, because regional activity and regional action has to happen. So we are not in disagreement on that. I 100% agree that those conversations have to happen. I think we saw, just some of the difficulty that it seems like was experienced just talking about expanding the North-South Metro link with that table, that took a bit of a fight. And so I would anticipate that if it's a trouble just expanding public transit, we're certainly going to have trouble trying to encourage that same group of people to heed a regional call. But I certainly would support us in making it.
It's also for St. Louis County Council members, the difficulty is they could only put, say, a county-run shelter in unincorporated areas. They can't force Maplewood, Brentwood, Olivet to open shelters. But one thing I asked the mayor is it possible to maybe talk with the city, the county, and maybe an inner ring suburb that's close to the city and have some sort of cost-sharing agreement where, you know, multiple jurisdictions are paying for more shelter space in like a county municipality?
I mean, I think the thing is, I think the territory of a regional approach to the unhoused issue, because it has been so unexplored, and I've not seen that conversation at all. I think the direction that you can go into with that is countless. However, maybe. Yeah, infinite. It's infinite. Who knows what's on the table there? And I'm always an advocate for innovative leadership that solves problems, right? And so that would bring us back to why we're at Board Bill 227, because while, of course, we need a regional call, the truth is that our surrounding counties are sending their unhoused folks here, and those unhoused folks are here. So while we're having a regional conversation, which I haven't seen yet, but will 100% support when it happens, we still do have to figure out solutions that are facing our city right now. And we do know, I know that those images were all over the place of folks who, I mean, they are, whether they're, and for me, I'm never going to be, I'm not checking an unhoused person and asking, where are you from? You know, I'm not trying to verify borders when you come here and you're unhoused and you're in need of resources. That's not my role. My role is to say that I have constituents and I have community who constantly tell me that there's a lack of capacity. And I think even when you think about the fact that 20% of the kids in St. Louis public schools are unhoused, that means we've got about 5,000 children and families that are verified city residents that are unhoused. So even if you're talking about a regional approach, we still have folks right here in our region that we don't have enough capacity for.
I watched the hearing about your bill. Some of your colleagues had some, what I would feel, substantive questions about the legislation, but they weren't completely on board with it. Mm-hmm. How do you think the trajectory of this bill is going to go over the next few weeks and months?
I make a prediction that this bill will pass. I make a prediction that we will certainly get this out of committee. We will get it onto the floor. We have to have the ability to have hard conversations with each other, or we shouldn't be leaders and we shouldn't be elected to lead our communities for sure. And so I think what you saw at the HUD meeting that we had this weekend was actually a great demonstration of that. For me, that's why you file legislation. That's why you call a hearing. And especially with that meeting where I said I'm not calling for a vote. That's my way of letting everyone know what I want is your feedback. What I want is your input. Help me find what may be missing. Help me figure out how we can make this stronger. And so I think the conversation we had on Tuesday was phenomenal. And all you might need to do to really get a gauge for that is compare that first hearing to the last first hearing.
It was a little bit friendlier.
Yes. It's a lot friendlier. And so I think that what you're seeing now is just what I think people voted for. People said, hey, I want to vote for people with aligned values because I hope that means that we will see progress happen and issues happen. I hope that means that our leaders will put their personal feelings to the side and have the hard conversations and do what's best for the collective. And I think this bill is a way that we will get there. I suspect there'll be a few amendments that I look forward to making. And I even think some of their suggestions were excellent, and I can't wait to incorporate those into the bill.
Alisha Sonnier is the Alderwoman for St. Louis's 7th Ward, representing areas of South St. Louis. Alderwoman, thank you so much for joining us.